Let's reset the timeline, because what's happening in the Red Sea right now didn't come out of nowhere. 2 weeks ago, when the Houthis first started targeting commercial vessels, most people barely noticed. It was treated like background noise, another brief ripple in the region that always seems to be on edge. But that first wave of attacks wasn't noise. It was the opening move in something much bigger. And if you've been following this channel, you already know we covered that phase, the moment when the targets shifted from military or politically connected vessels to ordinary commercial ships that had nothing to do with the conflict at all. That shift matters because when a militant group aims at global shipping lanes, not enemy forces, not military assets, but the arteries of world trade, they're not just fighting a symbolic fight. They're testing the entire global system. And the moment those first drones hit the water, every serious analyst understood exactly what was coming next. And that's when the response began. Within days, the United States didn't just increase its naval presence. It reshaped the entire layout of the region. You saw destroyers flowing in, the Carney, the Mason, the Thomas Hudner, the Laboon, ship after ship establishing a rotating layered defense system. These weren't ceremonial deployments. These weren't diplomatic gestures. This was the construction of a shield, radar by radar, missile tube by missile tube, because someone in Washington clearly believed that things were about to get worse before they got better. And it wasn't just the United States. The UK stepped in with the HMS Diamond, one of the most advanced air defense destroyers in the world. France followed with the Languedoc, and then additional air defense assets repositioned toward the Bab el-Mandeb corridor. And even Germany, a country that normally moves at the cautious diplomatic speed, announced participation and began preparing ships for deployment. Why? Because once commercial ships began rerouting around Africa, bypassing the Suez Canal entirely, every economy in Europe rang the alarm. When Maersk, MSC, BP, Evergreen, and CMA CGM all start diverting ships within days of each other, this isn't a regional disturbance. That's a global supply threat. That's an early warning of an economic shock that could ripple all the way from Shanghai to Rotterdam to Los Angeles. And then the targeting shifted again. After the attacks on the apolitical commercial vessels, the Houthis began probing ships connected to Israel. Not military cargo, not weapon shipments, just vessels with ownership or trade routes that touched anything Israeli. And from there, the escalation widened again. They began targeting vessels simply for sailing toward Israel, even if they weren't delivering anything remotely military. That's not random. That's messaging. They're signaling that they can pressure Israel without setting foot near Israel. They can hurt global trade without ever stepping outside Yemen. They can drag international powers into the conflict without firing a single shot at their militaries directly. And so the U.S. response shifted to, at first, the Navy was reacting to intercepting drones, shooting down incoming threats, escorting commercial vessels. But over the last several days, something changed. These escorts have become proactive, not reactive. We're not just intercepting attacks, we are preventing them. And that's the moment you know a conflict has entered a new phase. Coalition escort operations aren't passive. They're a statement. You don't put American, British, French, and soon German warships in the same maritime choke point unless you're preparing for the possibility that this doesn't stop on its own. This is a layered defense doctrine, and that doctrine only shows up when someone believes the threat is becoming a durable and persistent threat, no longer temporary. And the Houthis know exactly what they're doing. Every attack is a probe. Every wave of drones is a data gathering exercise. They're studying how destroyers move, how quickly radar locks on, which interceptors fire first, how coalition ships coordinate, where the blind spots are. This is training for them, live fire practice on the world's busiest shipping corridor. 2 weeks ago, the drones were simple, short range, inaccurate, low tech. Now, we're seeing long-range one-way attack drones, higher altitude flight paths, multi-vector launches, swarm tactics, and in some cases ballistic missiles being fired into maritime trade lanes. Yemen didn't suddenly invent that technology. These aren't garage-built Frankenstein drones. This is state-level capability, and everyone knows exactly which state provides it. And that brings us to the real point. Escalation is no longer theoretical. The Houthis believe the US and its allies are constrained politically, economically, strategically, and they're right. The United States doesn't want a direct regional war. Britain doesn't want a prolonged naval campaign with high-cost defensive operations. Europe cannot afford higher energy and shipping prices. And Israel is already engaged in Gaza. So the Houthis are exploiting hesitation, and right now it's working. That's why we're watching the fastest naval buildup in the region in over a decade. The coalition is trying to stop escalation without causing escalation. And that thin line rarely holds forever. We're now entering the third phase of the conflict. Phase 1 was testing commercial vessels. Phase 2 was targeting Israeli-linked ships and military-adjacent routes. Phase 3, where we're at right now, is about overwhelming the coalition through repetition, coordination, and persistence. The Houthis don't need 100 successful strikes. They need one that gets through. One that hits a commercial tanker under escort. One that causes casualties. One that forces a public political response. Because the truth is simple. The Red Sea isn't a crisis. It's a fuse. And every day that fuse burns a little bit shorter. When you look at what's unfolding right now, you have to understand something that the mainstream refuses to acknowledge. Conflicts don't escalate in straight lines. They escalate in layers. And over the last week, a new layer has been added, one that changes the strategic balance entirely. Because now, it isn't just about the Houthis attacking ships. It's about how many nations are being forced to reshape their foreign policy to respond. The United States didn't wake up one morning and decide to throw multiple destroyers into the Red Sea for fun. The British didn't suddenly feel nostalgic about early 2000 naval patrols. France didn't just casually send an air defense frigate into a high-risk maritime corridor out of boredom. None of this was spontaneous. All of it was reactive. And the reason it happened so fast is because the threat didn't stay in the place where policymakers expected it to live. It expanded. It started hitting the arteries of Europe's economy, Asia's export routes, and the Middle East energy supplies all at once. The Red Sea is the kind of place where one ship getting hit doesn't just damage its hull. It damages the global economy. It sends tremors through insurance markets, oil markets, commodity markets, and shipping indexes. And when world leaders saw major carriers refusing to transit the region, everything changed. You cannot have the Suez Canal, one of the most strategically important water corridors in modern civilization, suddenly become optional. When Maersk paused operations for the second time, that was the moment the political class internally said, all right, this is no longer containable. But here's the part that should make people pay attention. The defensive successes of the US and coalition navies are not signs of stability. They're signs that the threat environment is becoming more sophisticated. When you intercept something every day, people assume that means you're winning. In reality, intercepts mean you're being tested. It means the opposition is willing to lose drones, missiles, and credibility just to study you in real time. And don't think for a second that Iran isn't watching this like a live tactical laboratory. They've been using proxy groups, from Hezbollah to the Houthis to Iraqi militias, as extensions of their strategic influence for years. And the Red Sea is now the canvas where Iran can practice long-range harassment without direct attribution. Because the truth is, they don't need to fire anything themselves. They just need someone else to keep the pressure on to stretch Western resources thin, to raise the cost of stability. When you maintain a naval shield this large, US destroyers, British Type 45s, French Frem frigates, you're burning through readiness, you're burning through munitions, you're burning through operating hours. And every hour you spend intercepting drones in the Red Sea is an hour you are not postured for deterrence somewhere else. That's what adversaries really want. They want the West spread out, distracted, exhausted, and arguing about how much involvement is too much. And while that debate is happening in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, the Houthis continue to push. This last week alone, we've seen drones launched from deeper inside Yemen, following flight paths designed to expose radar coverage limits. We've seen attempts to target ships from angles that stress the engagement envelope of interceptor systems. We've seen ballistic launches meant to test whether coalition ships would escalate their response. This is not random. This is not emotional. This is technical, patient, calculated probing. And remember, the coalition can only intercept what they can see. They can only fire on what they can track. They can only respond to what they can legally classify as a threat. The Houthis know this. They're trying to find the seams in the system. They're trying to see how tightly the coalition will hold the rules of engagement. Because if the coalition slips, if one ship hesitates or misinterprets a threat, that's when things break open. And that's why the political layer matters. Everyone is waiting to see whether the United States will shift from defensive operations to offensive strikes. Not a symbolic bombing, but sustained action designed to degrade launch capability. If that happens, the conflict transforms instantly, because one direct strike on Yemen's coastal batteries risks triggering responses from Tehran, Hezbollah, or other affiliated groups. This is how regional fires spread, not because one nation decides to start a war, but because each actor pushes a little harder each day until someone crosses a threshold they can't retreat from. And right now, the threshold is closer than the public realizes. The US Navy is not sending daily warnings by accident. The Pentagon isn't leaking phrases like full spectrum options because they enjoy dramatic language. They're signaling two things at once: reassurance to allies and deterrence to adversaries. But deterrence only works if the other side believes you're willing to act. And right now, the Houthis clearly believe they can escalate without paying a personal cost. And this is where things turn dangerous. Because the longer you allow a militant group to disrupt global shipping, the more emboldened they become. And the more emboldened they become, the more likely they are to miscalculate. One drone getting through and hitting a tanker carrying oil, LNG, pneumonia, or chemicals, that's not a minor event. That's a global headline. That's an environmental disaster. That's a financial shockwave. And if that happens under coalition escort, the pressure to retaliate becomes overwhelming. But retaliation isn't simple. The US doesn't want to widen the conflict. The UK doesn't want a naval campaign that drags into 2026. France doesn't want to be seen as escalating the war climate in the Middle East. Germany doesn't want to be in the crossfire of a new confrontation with Iran. Every nation in this coalition has a different calculus, a different threshold, a different red line. Meanwhile, the Houthis have nothing to lose. And that asymmetry, that gap between what the West risks and what the Houthis risk, is the core of the problem. The coalition is trying to defend world trade without triggering a broader war. The Houthis are trying to trigger a broader war without dying in one. And that's why the next phase will not be decided by military capability. It'll be decided by political will. Someone is going to break the stalemate, either by escalating the attacks or by escalating the response. And whichever side moves first will shape the entire trajectory of this conflict. Because the Red Sea is not a crisis. It is the hinge on which the next chapter of the Middle East may turn. And here's the part no one wants to acknowledge. Not the politicians, not the commentators, not even the institutions trying to manage this crisis quietly behind the scenes. What's happening in the Red Sea right now is no longer about Yemen. It's not even about Houthis versus Israel. It's about what happens when a globalized world discovers in real time that the very systems it relies on for food, fuel, shipping, trade, stability are far more fragile than anyone admits on camera. The Red Sea isn't a battlefield. It's an X-ray. And what it's revealing is a world where military deterrence, economic independence, and geopolitical balance are all starting to separate, like tectonic plates that spent decades under pressure and finally begin to pull apart. Think about where we are. 2 weeks ago, this was a regional threat. 48 hours ago, this was a multinational security effort. Today, it's a full-scale test of Western credibility. Not because the Houthis have overwhelming firepower. They don't. Not because the U.S. Navy is incapable. It isn't. And not because shipping companies are overreacting. They're not. It's because the crisis exposes one thing great powers hate facing: that small actors with the right tools, the right backing, and the right timing can shake global order in ways that used to require nations and armies. And that's why this moment feels different. Let's walk through what's really happening beneath the surface. The United States has committed destroyers, cruisers, ISR aircraft, and carrier support. The United Kingdom has deployed destroyers and reinforced air defense coordination. France has committed advanced frigates and surveillance assets. Germany, initially cautious, is now discussing expanded naval roles through the EU framework. Other allies have added ships, drones, or logistical support. This isn't symbolic. This is a coalition forming at speed we haven't seen since anti-piracy campaigns of the early 2000s. But here's the difference. Pirates didn't have ballistic missiles. They didn't have Iranian technology. They didn't have drones capable of 1,200-kilometer range. And they certainly weren't shaping the global economy with a handful of launchers and a political message. The Houthis are doing something unprecedented. They're exploiting the seams in the global security system. They know the West cannot afford hits on commercial vessels. They know shipping companies are risk-averse to the extreme. They know insurers are already recalculating premiums. They know every 10 to 14-day detour around Africa compounds inflation in Europe, Asia, and even the US. And they know Iran benefits from every minute this crisis stays alive. So they escalate just enough to cause stress, but not enough to trigger a full-scale retaliation. That's not chaos, that's calibration. And that brings us to the next uncomfortable truth. The West is running two races at once. One race is military, intercepting drones, protecting ships, containing escalation. The other race is psychological, projecting confidence in a system that is visibly under strain. Because here's what Washington, London, and Paris understand. If the Red Sea becomes a symbol of Western hesitation, you don't just weaken the shipping lanes, you weaken deterrence everywhere. Asia watches, Russia watches, Iran watches, non-state actors watch. Everyone studies the pattern. And right now, the pattern says a determined militant group can choke the arteries of the global economy faster than the world's most powerful navies can stabilize them. That's the lesson no one wants to talk about, but everyone is learning in silence. So what happens next? This is where the geopolitical zoom out matters. Every major conflict in the past century, World War I, World War II, the Korean War, or even the Gulf War, had a pressure-building moment that people recognized only in hindsight. A moment where the world didn't collapse, but it revealed its fault lines. A moment where a regional fight exposed the deeper weaknesses of the international order. A moment where nations realized the system they built wasn't as durable as they assumed. This is one of those moments. Because the truth is, the Red Sea crisis isn't happening in isolation. It's happening while Europe is stretched thin by Ukraine, Asia is bracing for Taiwan tensions, the Middle East is balancing on a knife's edge, global inflation is still unstable, energy markets are fragile, public trust in government is historically low across the West, and military recruitment in most NATO countries is scraping the bottom of the barrel. This is a world running hot, a world in transition, a world where the old assumptions, the ones that held everything together, are starting to break down. And for the first time in a long time, the United States is not trying to manage a crisis. It's trying to manage the perception of its ability to manage one. Because perception is power. Perception moves markets. Perception stabilizes allies. Perception deters adversaries. That's why every destroyer matters. Every interception matters. Every alliance announcement matters. They're not just military actions. They're psychological signals. Signals meant to say, we still have control. We still have reach. We still set the tempo. But the Houthis, backed by Iran, sheltered by geography, strengthened by asymmetric warfare, are playing a different game entirely. They're not trying to win militarily. They're trying to win strategically. They're showing the world that the West cannot protect every lane, every shipment, every route, every time. And if you can prove that once, you can prove it again. That's why this moment is so important. Not because a single drone will change the global order, but because the global order is now vulnerable to single drones. That is the shift. That's the real escalation. That's why this crisis feels like the opening chapter of something the world isn't ready to define yet. Let me close with this. People think power collapses suddenly. It doesn't. It erodes. It frays. It becomes uneven. It starts to bend before it breaks. And what we are witnessing in the Red Sea is the bending phase, the moment where the old world order flexes under pressure, trying to decide whether it still has the strength to hold or whether something new is about to take its place. This isn't just a maritime standoff. It's a stress test for the 21st century. And the results aren't in yet. But the clock is still ticking, and the Red Sea is still changing shape. If this breakdown gave you clarity, do me a favor. Hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of long-form, deep dive content matters. Subscribe, because the situation is evolving by the hour, and the next update is already forming. Drop a comment. I read every single one of them, and your perspective shapes what I cover next. And if you want the rapid-fire, real-time updates I can't fit into these long videos, follow me over on TikTok, the Watchman 98. Daily, short-form intel, no fluff, no filler. And for the extended conversations, the mindset framework, and the geopolitical deep dives, check out the Watchman 98 podcast. It's now on Spotify. Stay informed, stay ahead, and as always, stand watch.